My name is Claire Bennett. I am 34 years old. I live in Atlanta, Georgia. I work the night shift at a hospital where I have been a nurse for 11 years, and I want to tell you about the Tuesday evening in October, when my phone rang at 8:45 while my children were asleep, and a woman named Karen introduced herself in a voice that was trying very hard to be calm, and explained that she was calling because she had found my number saved in her boyfriend's phone under the name Work Contact Chicago, and she wanted to ask me one question before she said anything else, which was whether I knew a man named Michael Bennett. And I said yes. I said, of course I know Michael Bennett. I said, Michael Bennett is my husband, and the silence that followed that sentence was the longest silence I have ever sat inside, longer than the silences in hospital rooms, longer than the silence after difficult news, the particular silence of two people on either end of a phone call who have just understood simultaneously that the world they each believed they were living in does not actually exist. And I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this story, which is that I was not a woman who ignored things. I was not a woman who looked away from problems. I was a nurse. I was trained to notice details. I was trained to read situations carefully and respond to what was actually there rather than what was convenient. And I had spent 8 years of my marriage doing exactly that with the man I loved, reading him carefully, trusting what I saw, believing the version of our life that he showed me every day. And what I learned on that Tuesday evening in October is that being careful and being right are not the same thing, and that the most complete lies are not the ones that have no evidence. They are the ones that have been constructed so carefully around the truth that the evidence points the wrong way every single time you look at it. And I want you to hold that thought as I tell you the rest of this, because it is the thing I most needed someone to tell me in the months that followed, and the thing I most want you to take with you when this story is finished. Michael and I met when I was 24 years old and he was 27, at a hospital fundraiser that a colleague had dragged me to on a Friday evening when I would much rather have been at home, and he was standing near the bar in a dark blue jacket, looking slightly bored in the way that attractive people at events they did not particularly want to attend often look. And I walked past him to get a glass of water, and he said, "Excuse me, I noticed you came in alone." And I said, "Yes, I did." And he said, "I have been standing here alone for 40 minutes, and I would very much appreciate the company of someone who also does not want to be here." And I laughed, and that was it. The beginning of everything. A dark blue jacket, and a Friday evening, and a man who made me laugh in the first 30 seconds of knowing him. And over the following months I fell in love with Michael Bennett in the complete and unguarded way that you fall in love when you are 24 years old and you have not yet learned that love and knowledge are two different things, that you can love someone completely and still not know them, that the person you love and the person they actually are can occupy the same body for years without you ever understanding the distance between them. And I do not say this to suggest that what I felt was not real, because it was real, entirely and completely real. I say it because I think it is important to understand that love does not protect you from deception. It simply makes the deception more expansive when it finally arrives. And that cost, which I did not understand was coming, is what I want to tell you about. We married 3 years after we met, in a small ceremony in Savannah, with 60 guests and a reception that went until 2 in the morning, and I stood beside Michael in a dress I had found in a vintage shop on a Tuesday afternoon and felt the particular certainty of someone who has found exactly the right thing in exactly the right place. And the years that followed were the years I had always imagined my life would look like: a house in Atlanta, 2 children, a career I was proud of, a husband who came home and asked about my day and knew the names of my patients and held our children in the particular way that good fathers hold their children, with their whole body, like they are the most important thing in the world. And I want to be clear about something, which is that Michael was not a cold man, was not a distant man, was not a man whose love felt performed or absent. He was present when he was present, warm when he was warm, and the life we built together felt real to me in every moment I was inside it, which is what made the phone call so completely disorienting. Not just that he had lied, but that the truth of what he had been doing existed simultaneously alongside something that felt completely genuine. And I have spent years since that Tuesday evening trying to understand how those two things can occupy the same person. And I am still not entirely sure I have found the answer, but I have come to believe that some people are not lying when they love you. They are simply also loving someone else, and they have decided that this is a problem they can manage rather than a truth they are obligated to tell. We had 2 children by the time I was 32, a boy named Eli who was 6 and a girl named Sophie who was 4. And our life in Atlanta had the particular texture of a life that is full and moving. School pickups and grocery runs and Saturday mornings at the park and Sunday dinners with neighbors and the ordinary, beautiful chaos of raising small people who are becoming themselves. And Michael was part of all of it, present in the specific ways that matter to children, He was the one who knew which cartoon Eli was obsessed with that particular month, the one who had memorized Sophie's bedtime story preferences and could recite them on request, the one who showed up to school events and parent-teacher conferences and birthday parties with the particular ease of a man who genuinely wanted to be there. And I watched him with our children and felt grateful the way you feel grateful when the life you are living matches the life you imagined. And I want to tell you this because I want you to understand the full weight of what the phone call dismantled. It was not just my marriage, it was the entire architecture of the life our children were growing up inside, and that is the part that took the longest to grieve. Not the loss of the husband, but the loss of the father I had believed I had chosen for them. Michael was a sales manager for a pharmaceutical company, which meant he traveled, sometimes 2 weeks out of every month, sometimes more. And I had never questioned this because I had met his colleagues and attended his company events and seen the emails and the itineraries and the hotel receipts that came through our shared account. And it had all looked exactly like what it was supposed to look like because Michael was a man who understood that the most effective cover is not a fabrication but a reframing of the truth. He was actually traveling for work. He was actually staying in those hotels. He was actually attending those meetings. What he was also doing was spending the days between the meetings and the evenings after the work dinners with a woman named Karen in Nashville, Tennessee, a woman he had met at a conference 3 years into our marriage, a woman he had told he was divorced, a woman he had been building a second life with for 5 years while I was working night shifts and raising our children, and trusting the version of him that came home to Atlanta every week, with stories about the road and exhaustion in his eyes that I now understand was not the exhaustion of travel but the exhaustion of maintenance, of keeping to complete and separate lives running simultaneously without either of them touching the other, which requires a particular kind of daily discipline that I could not have imagined before I understood it was happening, and which I now recognize as the thing that should have been a warning but was instead just what I called his dedication to his work. There were signs, and I want to be honest about this because I think the question of whether you should have known is one that every person in my situation asks themselves, and the honest answer is that there were things I noticed and explained away. Not because I was foolish, but because the explanations he offered were always plausible, always consistent with what I knew about his life, always just reasonable enough that choosing to believe them was the easier and more logical thing to do. There was the evening he came home from a trip and his suitcase smelled like a different detergent than the one we used, and he said the hotel laundry had cleaned some of his clothes. There was the phone that was always face down on tables, which I attributed to his habit of not wanting to be distracted during conversations. There was the birthday he forgot, which he apologized for so completely and with such evident genuine distress that I felt guilty for having been hurt by it. And there was the Christmas 2 years before the phone call when he seemed distracted in a way I could not name, present in the room but somewhere else entirely. And I asked him about it and he said work stress, and I believed him because that was the explanation that fit the life I understood us to be living. And I am not going to spend the rest of my life wondering whether a different choice at any of those moments would have changed anything. Because the truth is that a man who is committed to maintaining a deception will always have a better explanation than the one you are reaching for, and the absence of proof is not the same as the absence of truth. Karen had been with Michael for 5 years when she found my number, and she had found it not through suspicion but through accident. She had been using his phone to look something up while he was in the shower, and she had seen a text thread between Michael and someone saved as work contact Shakar. And the texts were ordinary enough, logistical, about schedules and timing and what time he would be home. But there was something in the tone of them that did not read like work to her, something familiar, something that felt like the shorthand of people who have been coordinating their lives together for a long time. And she had written down the number and waited 3 days, and then when Michael was on another trip she called, and I answered, and she said her name was Karen, and she asked me her one question, and I gave her my answer, and the silence came, and then she said, I think we need to talk. And we did. We talked for 2 hours, 2 women sitting in separate houses in separate cities, going through 8 years of a shared life from opposite ends, finding the places where our stories overlapped and the places where they diverged, and understanding slowly and then all at once the full architecture of what Michael had been building and maintaining for 5 years while each of us believed we were the primary truth of his life. And at the end of those 2 hours, Karen told me she was 8 weeks pregnant. She had told Michael 2 weeks earlier. He had seemed happy. And I sat in my kitchen with my phone in my hand and looked at the drawings my children had made that were hanging on the refrigerator and said nothing for a long time because there was nothing to say that would make the next sentence easier to reach. What those 2 hours on the phone with Karen felt like, I want to describe carefully because I think it matters, and the most accurate description I have is this. It felt like the particular dizziness of someone who has been walking on ground they believed was solid and has just discovered it was suspended. That feeling of the floor dropping not dramatically or all at once but in pieces, each new detail Karen shared removing another section of what I had been standing on, and I kept asking questions not because I needed more information but because some part of me was still looking for the version of the story where this made sense, where there was an explanation that reconciled what I was hearing with the man I had been married to for 8 years and the father I had watched hold our children, and that version did not exist. And the moment I understood that it did not exist was the moment everything became very quiet. Not peaceful, but quiet, in the way that things go quiet when you have finally stopped fighting what is true. And Karen and I said goodbye with the understanding that we would speak again and neither of us knowing exactly when, and I sat in my kitchen in the silence that followed and waited for my husband to come home. Michael came home at 11 that night, later than expected, with his suitcase and the particular tiredness he always carried back from trips. And he came through the front door and set his bag down and looked up and saw me sitting at the kitchen table in the dark with my phone in front of me, and something in his face shifted. Something small and fast that I would not have noticed if I had not been looking for it. A recalibration, a reading of the room, the same expression I had seen on patients who come into the hospital knowing something is wrong and are trying to assess how much the person in front of them already knows. And he said, "Hey, why are you sitting in the dark?" And I said I was waiting for him, and he sat down across from me and asked if everything was okay. And I said I had an interesting phone call this evening. And I watched the recalibration happen again, faster this time. And I said, "Her name?" I said, "Karen." And the word landed in the kitchen the way I knew it would. And Michael's face did the thing that faces do when a person has been caught completely. Not the dramatic collapse that movies show you, but something quieter and in many ways worse. A kind of stillness, like a machine that has been running at full capacity for years and has just been switched off. And we sat in that kitchen for 3 hours while he told me everything. Not because he wanted to, but because I already knew enough that there was nothing left worth protecting. And at the end of those 3 hours I asked him to leave, and he did. And I sat alone in the kitchen until the sun came up and my children came downstairs and asked what was for breakfast, and I made eggs and toast and poured orange juice and sat with them at the table and watched them eat, and understood that this was the actual work, not the confrontation or the revelation or the 3 hours in the kitchen, but this, sitting at a table with 2 small people who needed breakfast and did not yet know that their world had changed, and doing it completely, without falling apart in front of them. The divorce took 8 months, and Michael lost both families in the same month because Karen left him too. And I want to be honest with you about how I felt when I learned that. Which is that I felt nothing that resembled satisfaction. Not because I am particularly generous, but because satisfaction requires energy, and in those months I had none to spare. Every unit of energy I had was going toward my children and my work, and the daily maintenance of a life that had to keep functioning regardless of what had collapsed inside it. And what I learned in those months is something I think is worth saying plainly, which is that the period after a betrayal is not a period of healing, it is a period of surviving, and survival looks different from healing. It is less graceful and less linear. It is making school lunches and showing up for night shifts and answering your 6-year-old's questions about why daddy does not live here anymore with words you have rehearsed because the true words are not ones a 6-year-old should be asked to carry. And it is doing all of that while also beginning, slowly and in the margins of your days, to understand who you are when you are not the person someone has been constructing a lie around. And that understanding, which took longer than anything else, is the thing that eventually gave me back something I had not realized I had lost, which was the simple and complete experience of being a person whose life is exactly what it appears to be. Karen and I spoke twice more after that first phone call, once during the divorce proceedings when our lawyers needed us to coordinate on certain financial matters, and once about 6 months after everything was finalized. A conversation that neither of us had planned but that happened because she called one evening and said she did not know who else to call. And we talked for an hour about nothing in particular. About her daughter who had been born 3 months earlier. About my children who were adjusting slowly and with the particular resilience that children have that adults spend years trying to recover. About the strange experience of being the 2 people in the world who understood most completely what the other had been through without ever having chosen to be connected. And when we hung up, I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time and thought about that particular strangeness. 2 women who had never chosen each other, who had been placed in each other's lives by a man who had never fully chosen either of them, finding in each other a kind of understanding that required no explanation and no performance. And I want to tell you that this was one of the things that helped me most in those months. Not the formal support, not the therapy, though both of those things mattered, but the specific experience of being understood by someone who did not need anything explained. 3 years after that Tuesday evening in October, I am sitting in a different kitchen in a different house that is entirely mine, and my children are asleep down the hall, and my son, who is now 9, left his drawings on the table again, the way he always does, and my daughter, who is 7, told me tonight before bed that she wants to be a nurse because she wants to help people the way I do. And I sat on the edge of her bed and held her hand and felt something I have been slowly and carefully learning to feel again, which is the particular quality of a life that is simply and completely yours, not edited or managed or maintained for someone else's consumption, just real, just exactly what it actually is. And I want to leave you with the thing I most needed in those first months, which is this: the question of how you did not know is the wrong question. The correct question is not how did I miss it, but how did he maintain it? And the answer to that question is not about your intelligence or your attention or the quality of your love. It is about the particular skill of someone who has decided that the people around them are to be managed rather than truly known, and that skill has nothing to do with you, was never about you. And the sooner you stop making it about you, the sooner you can start making your life about something true, something that belongs only to you, something that no one can edit or reframe, something that is simply what it actually is. And that something, I promise you, is more than enough. Subscribe to She Said Enough, because there are more stories like this one, and every single one belongs to a woman who deserved better and found her way there anyway. And if this story stayed with you, leave me a comment and tell me the moment when you knew something was wrong before you were ready to admit it. Because you are not alone in that moment, and you never were.